Welcome to the Growth Ventures Podcast, the go-to platform for entrepreneurs, innovators, and changemakers. I'm your host, Hamlet Azarian. In this podcast, we delve into the world of business, technology, and innovation. We bring you conversations with industry leaders, disruptors, and visionaries who are shaping the future and making a difference. So whether you're an aspiring entrepreneur, a seasoned business owner, or simply a curious listener, join us on the journey of learning and growth. Welcome to the Growth Ventures Podcast. And now, let's delve into today's episode. Hey everyone, I'm super excited. Today we have on Nick Krasney. Nick today is a product manager at Google. Formerly, he was the CEO at Raydiant, a high-growth IoT startup. He was also co-founder at Philo, one of the first streaming services, while at Harvard. And then he got both his undergrad and MBA at Harvard Business School. So welcome, Nick Krasney. So Nick, before we get started, can you tell me a little bit about your journey and, when you first started getting into entrepreneurship and start?
Yeah, well, I grew up in the 90s and I was kind of a nerdy kid. I had like an NES in the house and computers and stuff when I was very young. And I really was fascinated by how they worked and how quickly they were changing. And I just loved the idea of inventing new things. Like I remember, I think when I was 5, I wanted to be a pilot. But like when I was 6, I wanted to be an inventor and really gravitated towards making like cool new things. So from a very young age, that was kind of what got me excited. And I learned how to program computers very young from kind of reading books.
Were you the kid that opened up the NES? Were you that one? Or you were the one that figured out how to hack it and kind of...
I didn't open it up because I worried that if I couldn't put it back together, that I couldn't play anymore. But I was definitely the kid who opened up my computer and was constantly fiddling with things there. It was also cool just seeing how quickly it was progressing, right? Like I remember 96 getting an N64. I remember in 6th grade getting broadband. I remember the various iterations of HTML5 and JavaScript coming along. I remember, going from learning BASIC to learning like C++ and trying to make little games and things. And it was really fun just trying to simulating the world and trying to make things work and all that. So that progress is really exciting to see. As I entered high school, I think the part of that really struck me was understanding how things work. And that led me down the route of physics. So took a ton of very hard classes, for me in high school. Got into a very good college, studied physics there. And I front loaded a lot of my requirements.
Humble man, a very good college. I got into Harvard and studied physics.
Oh, I guess you mentioned I got into the school that I really wanted to get into. I met my goal. How about that? I guess a year and a half into being a physics student, I sort of started realizing that I was having a little bit less fun doing that than I thought. And as I really try to understand why, I actually realized that the physics that I was super excited about was kind of like the physics of the 1870s or the physics of the 1930s, where you could open a book and see how clearly the models diverge from the real world. And there was just this period of time where an incredible amount of work could be done very quickly. And as you get to the 60s and the 70s and beyond, I just started realizing that I was getting less excited about that and more excited about the other thing I was doing in college, which was running a sketch show with one of my best friends. Actually, several of my friends. We would stay up late writing really dumb sketches, and then we would film them. And this was happening at a time when YouTube wasn't even out. So not only did we have to record stuff, write sketches, record them, edit them, host them ourselves on some servers, kind of own that whole process end to end. It was actually really fun realizing that putting on a show and making new things and being that inventor was actually the thing that was giving me pleasure.
That's pretty cool. So you're a content creator. You were like one of the first generation of content creators.
Yeah, in a weird way. I mean, we certainly weren't. I think we were successful at it in that we were having fun doing it. Right? We certainly didn't go viral or anything like that. But it made me realize that the most important output there was learning how to work with some really creative people on a thing, and then not just mastering the content component of it, but then also the distribution. Right? Like, how do we get content out there? It was not a solved problem because there were a ton of video sites that were coming up. YouTube felt like it was down all the time in 2005, 2006. And, we decided that we had to do everything on a shoestring budget because we were college students, right? Um, coming out of that though, I did a lot of exploring kind of the back half of college. I took more math and physics and stuff, but sort of realized that wasn't, grad school wasn't going to be what I wanted to do. And
So
the culture at the
how old
time,
are you in the story here? You're like 20-year-old?
18 to 21, 17 to 22, somewhere, that kind of range.
Right.
And, going to this kind of East Coast college, but growing up and going to public school in LA, it sort of felt like things coming out were very regimented, right? It's like, do you want to go to, here are your options, right? Let's open the career handbook here. Do you want to go to professional school, right? You can go to law school or business school. Do you want to go to grad school to get your PhD? You can go to medical school also. Let's not forget about that. Or do you want to go to consulting, right? You can go post up in a consulting shop. Or do you want to do any other thing for which we will provide very little support to you, if any at all, right? So coming out of college, I sort of knew that I loved working with my buddy Tuan. We took a circuit class. We were like building new things. We wanted to do a startup together. We sort of had a couple of ideas. We started pursuing them. And by the time we got out of that process, we came up with the idea for Philo, which is now one of the largest streaming services in the United States. And
That's amazing.
Doing really well. What we realized as we were graduating in 2009 was that the tidal wave of content that was starting to come online was not sustainable the way they were doing it at the time, and that it was going to recede. And that cable TV, the traditional cable bundle or that fountainhead of content, was going to have to come online and be paid for somehow. And we thought to ourselves that the incumbent companies out there, like the Comcasts of the world, might be really challenged given their existing relationships and business models and making that work. And no other single content company is going to have an easy time doing that either. So we thought about it.
By the way, how fast is the internet at this point? Like it's not the internet of today, right?
Well, that's a great question. The internet at universities is not dissimilar from the internet of today, at least. Again, I'm sure not in terms of raw speeds, but experience-wise, it was there was no shortage of bandwidth. I remember talking to one university administrator at a major university who was saying, like, yeah, our policy is if we run out of bandwidth, we buy more bandwidth, right? Like, other universities were literally telling us as late as 2011, 2012 that they're still trying to figure out Wi-Fi. So we were like, okay, well, mixed bag, right? But this was certainly at a time when streaming was not really a thing, right? You had a little bit, you had UGC content on like YouTube, but there weren't many big streamers except for like Hulu, and then Netflix was sort of emerging. And as we thought about what the disruptor in the space might look like, we realized that we had this really interesting value proposition that we could offer that a lot of the big companies couldn't. Specifically, we were on the Harvard campus. And what we noticed when we thought about the business of streaming content to younger people, this 18 to 24 demographic, we realized this is the most valuable demographic to content creators and the least valuable demographic to content distributors. The content creators really want them, right? You could sell ads to them. You create the right habits. All of the trendsetters, right? A lot of the great trends kind of came out of people in colleges watching content and really talking about it, especially historically.
Still do.
Yeah, that's right. Colleges continue to be really, really important in shaping trends. And we certainly know, like that old story about Apple, right? Having campus ambassadors and trying to make Mac a really big thing on universities because it just really shaped, frankly, the habits that everybody would carry forward. But if you have to roll trucks every year to change out cable boxes, fix things, you're competing with beer money, all of these things. If you're a distributor, it's not as hot of a value proposition. It's not your favorite customer, right? Your favorite customer is like someone who's like older and pays on time and doesn't require a lot.
Forgets that they're even paying.
That's right. That's right. I mean, and especially then, people were watching cable, linear traditional cable TV. Just it was part of the furniture, right? Like you would, if you didn't pay and it shut off, you'd notice right away, right? So we found a way to launch on the Harvard campus on May 1st, 2011. And on May 1st, 2011, we said, okay, great, we're launching. It's a Sunday. Family Guy's on. There's going to be like a basketball game. Like, The Apprentice is happening The Apprentice. And that happened to be the day that the Bin Laden killing was announced by President Obama.
Oh, wow.
And yeah. So our traffic jumped from, and within like a couple of hours of launching, our traffic jumped from nobody had ever heard of us to a quarter of the Harvard campus was watching. And those numbers stayed high throughout the finals period. So we suddenly had this thing where like people were using our stuff. We were able to introduce little feature changes every day. Like I remember
first official growth news hack. You jumped on the big news headline of the day.
That's right. Given large national news, people feel like we should be launching products more often. If that's how that works. But the timing really broke in our favor. And as that finals period emerged, like people would tell us like in the street, we didn't have a guide or anything. So like, I don't know what's on. So we were just like, well, we're not going to put the whole schedule on. So we're going to literally load a JPEG of what we think is cool. And then we're going to just slap it on the screen. And then people, again, on the street, we're just like...
The approach. You're like, we'll just put a picture up.
Right. Yeah, never underestimate the power of like just somebody picking stuff manually. Like never underestimate the power of like some hackish approach where somebody's doing things manually, right? We raised venture money that summer, and we were fortunate, connected with...
So you're still at school at this time? You're still, or have you finished school?
Oh, we graduated, and it took us time to work on the video infrastructure and all that. We were out of school, but we were still on the Harvard campus because somehow we managed to like hustle office space from really wonderful, supportive gentleman named Paul Bettino, who was running a technology and entrepreneurship center, like kind of scrappily getting some space for people to work out of the Harvard Student Agency's office.
It was like an accelerator at Harvard, or not official accelerator?
Kind of. It was 2009, 2010, 2011. So that even wasn't a thing. And then we really got additional support when our friend Gordon Jones opened the Harvard Innovation Lab at the Harvard Business School campus. And this was when Harvard started realizing, like, we want to get more serious about startups. We were invited to be the very first company inside of the building. And that was when they really started programming and, having a formal kind of office space and all of that. But it meant that we were really the first chapter of the business was on the Harvard campus. And, we're forever grateful for having that kind of space and accelerator support. We're also these things called non-resident tutors. Tutor doesn't mean that, and their language, we're not sitting there tutoring people, but we'd get like free lunch and dinner for being available for students. So we were able to like hustle office space, and Harvard supported us with like food and space. So we had a little bit of a supportive atmosphere, and we were kind of pioneers in this then. Like, I think that might be a more common pipeline now, but we really got lucky with that level of support. So that was all great. We raised money from venture capitalists. That allowed us to really hire some incredible people in the Boston area.
I'm gonna say this was the first time you raised any sort of money, and now have a real startup. You're like, wow. We got something happening here.
Yeah, we had no idea what we were doing. We made some amateur mistakes. We made some less amateur mistakes. But what was really lucky, and to be honest, that I don't think I appreciated until I got a little bit older, was as much as I felt like I was messing up at every step, and as emotionally taxing and anxious I felt every single instance, when I look back on it, so many things broke our way in a way that is kind of hard to explain, or maybe reflects the fact that maybe we got lucky or we're doing something right. For one thing, we just have the most incredible advisors. And we still have these incredible advisors. Our current CEO, Andrew McCollum, is one of the founding members of Facebook. He built something called Wirehog. And I remember Andrew and I going out and having waffles and like looking at wireframes and just chatting through simple approaches to make the product better. We had the benefit of Steve Willis, who was essentially one of the inventors of the multi-protocol router. I remember the first time we met Steve, we actually had no idea who he was. He was just an introduction. And we left the meeting being like, I don't know who this guy is, but he's really, really smart. And he seems to know an awful lot about networking for video traffic. We also met a guy named Hugh Pinero, who was the founder and CEO of XM Satellite Radio, who really guided us through the content industry and made critical introductions to us to HBO, who then made introductions to Dish, DirecTV, and other content players off the strength of our proposal and partnership with them. They later ended up investing and were really a wonderful partner, especially in the early stage of business.
How did you find these amazing people at this point in time? Like how did this all occur?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the best answer I can give is there's an easy answer and a hard answer. I think the easy answer is that we were at a university where there was traffic in really great people,
So put yourself as a founder in an environment that allows you to connect and meet with different caliber people.
Yeah.
So it might be an accelerator, it might be a university, it might be whatever it is, but make sure you're out there and you're part of a community so you can engage and meet different people. Is that like an advice you would give some like early stage startups?
Absolutely. There's a cross section of exposure to interesting things, and you can only get there by putting yourself out there. And by the way, like the second reason is, and I think this is harder but more generalizable, is that we asked. You
weren't afraid. You had nothing to lose. What do I have to lose, right? You got over like imposter syndrome. This is not going to work. What's the worst thing that could happen, right?
Or if nothing else, like this could be cool. So Andrew, who's been a really wonderful leader to the business for the last several years, and a super important advisor and investor to us in the earliest days. I remember how we met him. Somebody invited him to dinner at, I think he was in the ed school at the time, the Harvard Graduate School of Education. And somebody invited him to dinner to talk about startups. And we were the non-resident entrepreneurship tutors. So we had students there. We had a lovely dinner with him. He gave lots of great advice to students. And we were thinking like, we want to stay in touch with this guy, but we don't just want like a regular stay in touch. We noticed that Wayne Brady was performing on campus for whatever reason. Wayne Brady was in town and he was going to be performing with the Harvard Improv group. And Tuan and I were like sitting here thinking about it. And we were like, we bet, just knowing a little bit about Andrew from having met him a little bit, that if we invited him to go hang out with us and see Wayne Brady and grab dinner, that we could turn this into a really interesting kind of relationship and get to know this guy more. And that he wouldn't say no to seeing Wayne Brady with us if we asked him. So we're watching Wayne Brady do improv. And, it just really was a phenomenal beginning of a relationship.
You're like, this is how we courted our advisor. We basically took him to improv. That's awesome, man.
What's funny though is like, I don't want to put it all on us, but like we were clearly obsessed with what we were doing. Now that I'm on the other side and I find myself advising young people, I was invited to judge a startup panel, a startup contest at UCLA recently. And I managed to stay in touch with several of the people organizing and working on businesses. What I kind of noticed now that I'm on the other side is you can kind of tell when people are really in it, you can kind of tell when people are really trying. And in some cases you're looking at teams and you're like, oh, it's not the idea. That's just not the thing they're going to do. The next, right? Like this one, but you can sort of, now that I'm on the advisor side,
so true,
you can
it's never the idea, it's the person that, especially at the early stage,
That's right. That's right. And, that's exactly right. So I guess like fast forwarding a little bit, it's a couple years into the Philo story. We're now growing in the university space. We have incredibly complex supply chain and logistics stuff because we have to host this stuff on campus. We can't host it on the cloud for a range of legal and practical reasons. I have not been sleeping. I gained a ton of weight. I threw my back out. We got the PSEF in a really good spot. We brought on more senior leadership to help us. And I kind of realized two things. First thing I realized is this is it, right? This is a meaningful, valuable use of life. I really enjoy making new stuff and bringing it out there. And, whatever that 6-year-old, 7-year-old in me that like wanted to be an inventor, I'm like, okay, it's what it feels like, feels good. I want to chase the stealing. And then I realized, boy, oh boy, is this hard and is it kicking my butt, right? This is really tough. And after a couple of years, I applied to some business schools. I got into the business schools I wanted to get into and was very fortunate for that. And I just realized, like, I want to go spend some time now, like while we're expanding in the university space, really seeing how I can get good at it, because now I got a taste of it. I saw how rewarding and satisfying it could be. And I'm just going to spend the next 2 years really learning how to do this right, developing all the skills in finance and operations and leadership and marketing and, making lots of new friends and getting a ton of experience in different industries. So I spent 2 years at Harvard Business School. And since then, I've been either advising or growing different startups, or launching, and experimenting with different things. Or the last 2.5 years, I've been a product manager at Google Search, which has been very different from startups. Still scratches a lot of the itch of making new stuff. And it's fun making stuff at a scale of, lots and lots and lots and lots of people rather than, a specific initial market. And I guess in a very long, at this point, nutshell, that's my story.
That's amazing, man. No, I really enjoyed hearing overall where your Philo and story, the journey you went through, and as a very young founder, right? Here you are in your early 20s and clearly showed not only the ability to execute, but the ability to attract the right type of advisors and being self-aware enough, even in that journey yourself, realizing that, hey, it's time for me to kind of pivot and go and study and being able to walk away from that as well too. I'm sure that was a hard decision. And then what I really want to spend some time talking to you about, is you made a lot of great calls throughout your career, obviously, and you've been focused on particularly ops. I see when you were the chief operating officer at Raydiant when we started working together at one point where our paths had crossed there. Can you tell me a little bit about Raydiant, your experience there, and then we can start digging into some of the cool things you did there?
Yeah, definitely. Well, coming off of the experiences at Philo and business school and playing around with some stuff, sometimes it works great, sometimes it doesn't work at all. I think my current attitude on product and growth and operations and data and strategy is that at a certain point, they're all this one really big interdependent motion. And it's very hard to make good decisions, I think, without really understanding that whole picture. So I've been extremely fortunate because the various startups that, when you work in early stage companies, you kind of have to learn to be a generalist, and you sort of have to learn to understand, like, okay, do I understand how this thing works? Do I really understand how this thing works? Okay, is this something where, like, what constitutes good enough, right? Like, I don't need a PhD in this, but I certainly want to, learn more than what you would read on the Wikipedia page for this topic in order to make a decision. And then where is it like, no, we really need to bring in a specialist and manage a specific piece and all that. But Raydiant was a really good example. Raydiant was a company that was co-founded by Ho Tuan, who's my founder from Philo. I was working on something else, and Tuan calls me one day, and essentially I'd actually been working partly with his business as well. And he was describing to me that a business that had a lot of challenges and a lot of opportunities. The challenges were very typical of an early stage company.
So for the listeners, Raydiant, they have a hardware device that helps restaurants create digital signs.
Yeah,
right.
That's a great description. Tuan and his co-founders walked around and noticed how many menus were now becoming digital menus, and how many experiences that were traditionally analog were becoming digital experiences. And the company built a hardware solution, an HDMI connector that you could plug into the TV, and then a software solution, an app store where you can actually program that with the calendar of the day, the hotel, the menu, certain messages, including, real-time-ish notifications, and all sorts of other experiences later, including video calls and things like that. It's actually a really cool platform. And if you're a small business owner or a business owner with brick and mortar, I'd highly encourage you to check it out. But At the time, this was a company that had, I want to say 100 customers that they had kind of hustled through various needs. It was everything from, a small resort, I think in Montana, to, small chains of pizza restaurants that had been big believers in this and wanted to jump on as early adopters. And the challenges were pretty typical of the young startup, right? On the one hand, you had the classic personnel issues as you go from 5 to 10 to 15 to 30 and so on. How do we kind of scale up the org? How do we resolve, key processes that we need to work out between product engineering, sales, et cetera, marketing, of course. And then, of course, the opportunity was, this is a totally new space. How do we grow in an optimal way, given the fact that on the low end, you have people sticking a JPEG onto a USB stick and plugging it into their TV. And then on the high end, you have whatever airports are doing, right? Where you have the most sophisticated systems telling people that your flight was rescheduled, go from gate 35 to gate 22, right? And so to work through this, right, we obviously, the first thing we had to do was do what early stage companies have to do, which is grow. And we had to think through, how do we essentially grow better into the markets that we've already reached, which seem to be these 1 to 2 location, these storefront businesses. And then from there, on the product side with our app store, on the pricing side, on the growth marketing side, how do we then optimally extend our strategy to get the kinds of customers where we can deliver a ton of value, and that would then deliver a ton of value to us and our investors so that we could continue to raise capital and grow the business.
So it sounds like there was a wide range of different customers, right? So we had D2C customers, small restaurants who were more self-serve. They can come in, they can sign up, they can check out. And then potentially larger multi-chain type of enterprise or multi-location or franchisors. So probably a different sales cycle for them as well, probably a little bit longer. Is that a fair assessment? Or?
Yeah, that's definitely right. One thing that I kind of noticed is that when you're selling to a restaurant owner, or when you're selling to somebody who runs a small business that they kind of own themselves, they're not that different from D2C. They're actually, there's still a sales cycle because they need to understand how to integrate this hardware, what it is, the pricing model and all of that. But, we had a lot of success reaching these folks with techniques that were very traditionally direct to consumer. And then, of course, as with Philo, where we're selling to universities or to, other businesses where you're selling to large enterprises, it's just a much longer sales cycle, right? You have a lot of meetings and a lot of time before you get to the initial pilot. You have to have a certain level of success and progress of the pilot for a more limited rollout, and so on and so forth. And all the while, they're going to tell you features that they really need to see. And they're aware of all your competitors because they're writing a check that's not small, right? And the person you're dealing with, it's their job to make a good decision on behalf of the business and deliver value on behalf of their employer. It's a very different sales process, and you're benchmarking this against extraordinarily limited resources in terms of engineering, product, let's be real, financing, right? Because your investors want to see the different milestones before they're willing to put in different decisions. And communicating the thinking around this, using data and data modeling and making good strategic decisions, these questions propagate out into every other decision.
So here you are at Raydiant, 100 or so customers, probably data dispersed in different tools and platforms. I remember there was a a credit charge platform. There's the internal platform, and was it Salesforce or wherever it was?
All of the things. I think, and by the way, this is a huge credit to the early team for building this out. But I think we had a lot of Zapier going. I think a lot of things were held together with processes that, obviously were secure, compliant, really honored the opportunity with our different customers. But you look at this and you're like, yep, there's the glue. There's the, there's the duct tape, right? So we had data all over the place. One of the things that I did personally, especially towards the end of my tenure as COO was, actually kind of throughout, was just make sure let's get everything callable into a Jupyter notebook. And, let's make sure that everything can be put into, the appropriate data frames so that somebody wanting to work on this at the data level can actually work through it. That was, non-trivial, right? You have to make sure that we can securely and confidentially call production data, of various kinds, in a way where you can do analysis in it from different sources, and then
So
make sure that you're.
what's insight that you were able to pull from this that was kind of transformational or gave a little bit of clarity on where to lead strategy for them?
Yeah, certainly. I think that the most important number, and also the hardest to pin down for any kind of subscription business, is really deeply understanding churn, and in our case, is very fortunately negative churn. Understanding this has been true across a number of subscription businesses that I've been involved in. So I'll speak more generally for many businesses where I've done this exercise rather than any one specific one. But understanding churn, understanding what product decisions a user is making, and then understanding where you're actually able to drive growth and at what expense is really important when you're trying to sort of optimize growth in the short and the intermediate term. And then if there are pockets of customers where you have interested early adopters, but they are perhaps not adopting because they need some feature or benefit, and you get enough signal around that, and this could be like talking to salespeople, talking to customers themselves, et cetera, that's where you might want to make an investment in product. Say, okay, let's actually go and open up this specific vertical, which needs this specific feature. Churn and growth are, for subscription business, just incredibly important in informing every decision you can make. And one thing that I think people in these businesses don't appreciate well enough is that churn is incredibly hard to model. Well, I should say it's extremely easy to model wrong. But when you get to a level of nuance where you're looking at it, you have to remember that February has fewer days. Because you're like, why do we always have this weird, and then kind of stepping through it that way. That's the level of granularity, I think, where when you understand the model, when you understand data that deeply, you can start to make decisions that are going to help the business sort of longer term.
Got it. So what are some churn benchmarks that you would look at and you would be concerned, or you get super excited about it and be like, wow, this business is really healthy. Like we should, pour more marketing dollars, or whatever channel we're doing here seems to be working. Let's do more of that. Is there some high level guidance you can provide for people?
Yeah. I think that you want to try to figure out how to identify the features or engineer the features where you actually can see meaningful differences in things, So like talking about in absolute terms, well, this level of churn is good or this level of churn is bad. As you well know, it's very tough to identify that. And along with any other metric, you need to balance profitability, growth, and asset intensity, i.e. payback period, in order to say, okay, well, what does the business need right now? Do we need profitable growth that pays off in the distant future? Do we need more cash today, even if it's a little bit less profitable and growth is a little bit more slow? You can balance these different things. But for my part, I try to sort of look through different ways of slicing the data to get clues for things. And then I try then to make sure that we're not sort of p-hacking or going down the garden of forking paths, and, we'll try to make sure that we're not breathing our own smoke, right? There's lots of stuff that lots of ways to slice data and ways to fool yourself. But very often for a business, the naive way of slicing data will turn up some insights that inform your strategy, and then you can go and validate that in various ways to make sure that it's not just an artifact of the data or the way you're slicing things.
That's amazing. So looking back at your Raydiant period, what would you say is one of the more hidden lessons you learned? Like similarly, you learned some interesting lessons at Philo. What was the bigger lesson you learned while you were at Raydiant?
Certainly. Well, with respect to a lot of the churn stuff we discussed, I just want to emphasize that the lessons described there were things that I picked up across a lot of different subscription businesses and not just Raydiant. So they generalize, but they're also not, totally specific to any one business. With respect to lessons learned, I think that was where I really discovered two things. One is a lesson I already shared, which is that so many of these different decisions are interconnected. And, you really need to, I always feel like this was the physicist or, game person in me coming out and saying like, I need a near mathematical model of a machine in order to like understand and check my own decisions for things. But the second thing that I came to understand is like, once you start scaling a team and you're in a position of leadership, it's really important to remember that it is not necessary or appropriate for everybody to know every detail about everything. Now, people should have access to whatever they want, right? I think people should make sure if an engineer says to me like, hey, explain this growth thing to me, or hey, explain this operations thing to me. I'm don't conceal stuff. Obviously, that's not the takeaway here. But I think the most important thing is that having a group of people who are working at a startup and are, some mix of excited and anxious about its prospects because it's all early stage, right? Making sure that you can take all of the lessons that you're learning across different parts of the business and tell a story, right? A story that actually has story beats, a story that actually has a clear lesson, a story that actually is like, we noticed this and this and this, and that's why we're making this decision. By the way, a story ideally too that people can disagree with, like they'll understand the conclusion, but like, there has to be a point where you're actually making a call. Otherwise it's like sometimes things are just self-evident and no one's going to disagree, right? But making sure that that story is so clear that a person could go home or go to a new employee and repeat the story verbatim and answer like the follow-up questions to the story that are kind of implied by the context, or explain like what their economic role in this story is and how what they're doing is making a difference to the thing we're all doing. Man, that's hard, right? That is so hard and so important. And like all the stuff we've been talking about with mathematical modeling, like, that's not detail a lot of people need to know, but like making sure that like our customer support person or the new sales employee or the engineer that is joining and they have a little intro project on the front end, right? The fact that they can understand this picture well enough at an early stage company is just so important for their well-being.
What is the product we're building? Who are we building it for? Why is this important? And keep it succinct enough for them to understand and be able to relate and empathize with the customer. Something along the lines of that.
That's right. But let's even take it further. Who are we not building for? At least not yet, right? Who are we not building for? What are we not building right now? Why aren't we building? Oh, but I would think, it's funny. Like, I talked to this guy at a party. He thinks we should build this. Like, yeah, I can see why he thinks that.
But not right now.
Like, that's right. Not right now. Like, we can do all the things, right? But we can't do that right now. And more importantly, like people should be able to understand, even if they don't agree with it, people should be able to understand why we're doing or not doing things. And in my experience, those qualities are not just good management, right? But good leadership. Like, and anybody can be a leader. A good leader is like, this is why we're, even if people disagree and make it known, which is fine, which is great, right? Which is important. They can at least like understand the decisions we're making and have confidence that like a call was made.
That's amazing, man. That's a great lesson. So now I'd love to like jump into your current role at Google. Obviously, you had a phenomenal like experience as a startup founder and then as a CEO at Raydiant. On top of that, advising a bunch of different startups. I'm curious to see how that experience has transitioned and, what you're currently doing at Google, what you're working on, and what are some of the things you're learning along the way with your new role?
Yeah. So it's very different. I spent a lot of time after Raydiant working with different startups, helping to lead growth. Had a pretty good track record there. Again, continued to learn all sorts of things as we kind of reached the pandemic. And as I was going through that experience, I sort of thought about it and I realized like, okay, I've learned a lot of stuff in these early stage businesses. I continue to learn a lot of stuff in these early stage businesses. I've been doing this now since, when I graduated in 2009 and, we were approaching 2020 and the pandemic hit. And I thought carefully about it, and I realized, like, life is long. Um, I'd almost love to stay in this world, but how do I see the exact opposite of an early stage startup where we could all fit around a table and, uh, like I'll share one pizza, right? And the answer to that after exploring it was, I want to see what life is like being a product manager rather than at a cash flow negative early stage startup that's a speculative bet by some founders and VCs. Like, let's go to one of the most influential, successful, civilizationally important technologies that also happens to be, the principal moneymaker at like a Fortune 5, right? Like, let's go see the exact opposite of this. And I was very fortunate to be invited to be a product manager at Google Search. And when I was sort of applying and talking to the recruiters and all of that, part of me was a little bit concerned that, even with what I thought would be, plenty of pedigree or whatever it is, it was kind of 5 years out of business school. And I'm like, all right, do they know what to make of this weird background where like I've grown a lot of startups and things, none have exited yet, but fortunately the Google machine, I think, was pretty good at identifying that. Chatted with a couple of different teams, was really fortunate to meet a team at Google that was really focused on the health of the web and the role that Google has to play in the ecosystem. My first project at Google Search was actually working on the product feature that allows you to follow websites out of the Chrome browser. That was a really exciting product because, I can sit in a room and I know that a lot of people have Chrome in their pocket and that feature is on Chrome. And ipso facto, I've done something that would be impossible or really difficult to do as a startup, which is to get something in that many people's pockets, right? So that's been really exciting. I was also really inspired by the mission to, I think, help the open web, which is a really important, marketplace ecosystem technology for all of us. And I think on this specific project, the thing that I learned pretty immediately was how these roles are different when you start getting to the size and scope of Google. There are all kinds of considerations at a startup where you can kind of say like, yeah, we could, somebody will bring up like, well, you should build this thing or, you should worry about this thing. And I'm like, okay, sure. It'd be really fun if we had that problem. I can't wait to have that problem, right?
Or Google, they're like, hey, this could be a problem. Yeah. I don't realize this.
Yeah. Whereas like, I sort of had a realization at one point that once you're doing something at Google scale, it's not Murphy's Law exactly, right? Like anything that can go wrong eventually will. There is a whole class of problems where if anything can go wrong, you're going to find out on day one. So you better not. You better think ahead and be extremely careful.
What are all the things that can go wrong and how do we mitigate against all of them?
That's exactly right. And, I think one of the themes of this conversation has almost been the balance of being a generalist versus being a specialist. One of the great pleasures of being at Google Search is that you can specialize in things, like I can become a product specialist. I don't really have to worry about engineering quality because I know that Google's going to recruit the best in the world, all kinds of people that aren't just, great professionals, but great colleagues. I don't have to worry about, there's a lot of stuff I do have to worry about. Don't get me wrong. Like, product is very involved at Google and we are, formally on the engineering team. But, I don't have to worry about like, this is going to be too hard for that engineer. Like there's a whole set of machinery that's going to, take care of that. But yeah, so there's that Murphy's Law thing, so you just have to build for a lot of people on day one. And the upside then again is you can really build for a lot of people and think carefully about what consequences your product is going to have for the Google ecosystem, for the web ecosystem, and, really build great things for the future. So it's certainly been a different experience. It's certainly been a different experience from startups. It has pros and cons. One of the pros of having all of this big machinery that's there to help you do great work is that you have to learn how to use all of this big machinery to help you do that great work. That obviously involves a lot of meetings, a lot of writing, a lot of approvals, a lot of that stuff. But when something launches or with all of that, I also don't worry like I worry at a startup that the whole world's on my shoulders. And, if we miss something or if something goes wrong or if we make the wrong bet, it's very clearly attributable to, at least maybe this is me being some mix of conscientious and neurotic, right? But like the pressure, the profile of the pressure looks different. Very, very high stakes, but also diffused over a leadership chain, a team working on it, et cetera. And that sometimes lets you take bigger risks. And that sometimes, leads to that classic thing of, boy, why is it so hard to get things done in big companies? That's because when you do get them done, they're huge and it's very exciting.
That's awesome, man. So obviously you've had foray and seeing the vision at Philo for streaming service before it came to fruition. You were pretty involved at Raydiant, similar with digital signage as that was starting to get proliferated in the restaurant industry. I'm super curious what technology you see now. I know you and I nerd out sometimes of generative AI and how that's could potentially change the world or has begun to already. What do you see? Like let's maybe just talk about that. Generative AI, how does that change search, or does that even change the way people consume information in the near future?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I feel like I'm talking to the king of early adopters for generative AI. You were telling me about it years ago and all the ways that it was starting to become useful. I think in general, just taking a step back, I think much more senior folk than I at Google, including at Google I/O and other venues, have been talking about all of the things that Google's doing.
It was amazing, by the way, like Google I/O, and when we saw search and generative AI, how they intertwine. I thought that was really cool.
It's been really impressive, and it's also super impressive to me how quickly other product teams working on that have been able to make it work across so many different dimensions of the problem. It's really a testament to how incredibly talented people with a clear vision can execute and deliver value to a lot of people quickly. So it's been a fascinating and wonderful time to be in search. Stepping out of that world, though, and even the generative world, I think it's one thing that I like to look at when I consider what's coming next is, one, sometimes you have a big technology like generative, but that's rare that like a big new thing gets good enough to, like, I guess it's not. The interesting thing about generative has been that it's been around for a while, but it only recently crossed the threshold where it was really compelling and useful to a lot of people, right? And that's where I think the starter pistol really went off with ChatGPT. That's right. Like I remember GPT-2 and even GPT-3 were kind of like fun toy language models, like it sounded just credible enough.
It was close. You're like, this is pretty close. It just needs a little more massaging and we're almost there. But
yeah,
now
totally. Oh yeah. Now it's scary in a lot of instances. But another interesting thing to consider is when you have new combinations of technologies that become possible. I'm thinking a little bit about hardware now, and I'm thinking a little bit about my friend Pablo Zar's actually recent economics paper about this. But like self-driving cars only became possible because the power needed to run that many GPUs and that much compute power and those cameras only fit into a small enough sort of a car-sized thing fairly recently, right? Like you had the innovation of deep learning 10 years ago, but that's a new thing. So one thing that I try to pay attention to is where did the cost of something make it affordable for something to become possible, right? Where did the quality of something cross some threshold like GPT, where now suddenly you're like, this just became useful, not for everything, right? But this just became useful for something. Or where do new combinations of things become possible in a way that that's interesting. So sometimes on the side, like I'll pay attention to what hardware hackers are doing. There's a chip called like the ESP32. It is a very easy to program, not just in terms of the software, but also like the PCB. like getting a printed circuit made with an ESP32. I'll look at the new sort of ESP32s coming out, and I'll say like, okay, I have a chip that runs at a very high speed that has Wi-Fi and Bluetooth, and it costs like $5. What would I do with that now that they added this thing, right? So it's fun to look at combinations there. And then with the quality and range of things going on in GPT land, for example, I think it's not just useful to look at the quality of the model, but it's fascinating now to see the ecosystem of stuff coming up around it, right? So when Stable Diffusion came out, that was really exciting. But it was actually the ecosystem of tooling around it that got really exciting too, because suddenly, people were able to fit that into all sorts of products that no one product team would necessarily think to include it in, right? People are integrating it into Unreal, or people are, modding it to create sizes and dimensions of things that nobody had considered at that point, or the depth stuff or the control stuff. And now we're seeing similar things with language and auto GPT and, LangChain and all this stuff, where people putting, autonomous agents into ecosystems where they can interact with each other. And that leads to their own emergent properties that could become interesting stuff. So it's fascinating to watch all this happen in real time. But I guess in my sense, like what I look at single innovation, right? Like generative text, you could say like, you could say the obvious stuff of, I can't wait to put this into my text editor and, prompt it to write other text. But it's these like second and third order properties that I think over time get really, really fascinating. And at this point, they're moving so quickly that it's hard to even anticipate where it's going. What about you? I know you pay attention to a lot of this stuff as well.
No, I mean, I love the way you look at it. You look at, you just drop some serious knowledge for the audience on looking at when the costs are dropping, or how you can use this particular tool versus the next tool, or what does the emergence of this tool or this technology cost something else to gain value. So for example, in generative AI, I'm looking at it now and I'm wondering, does blockchain become relevant? Even more relevant now in terms of data and controlling data and saying that, hey, the LLM models are not allowed to use my particular data set unless I give them access to this particular data set. Or does that, instead of an open web that we've all been used to, does this force us to become a much more closed web? So these are the potential risks I see, right? So the personal data, or how you're going to relay and allow the sharing of that, is there going to be a new innovation that's going to foster that? So versus like, hey, I might have a device or a personal wearable, but I only want this tool or this system to have access to, or my social activities, I'm going to limit exactly what's out there on me, or I'm going to limit which websites are going to write, or publishers, what's going to end up happening with them. So these are the open questions I look for, and I see what disruptive technology has done and what the follow-on technology that's about to come, and how you can start taking advantage of that or utilizing that, or what's the utility. So that's what I look for, but I love the way you look at it as well too.
Oh yeah, and you and I've certainly had a lot of conversations recently and over the years about this stuff, which I always enjoy. As I love how. Again, as you're the king of early generative adoption and adoption with so many things, I'm always impressed with how forward-looking you are, and quite frankly, you're right at calling things right, which is why I'm honored you invited me. One of the reasons I'm honored you invited me to be on this podcast.
Well, Nick, thank you so much. This was a fabulous episode. Really enjoyed you sharing your story with the audience. If people wanted to get a hold of you, what's the best way that they can reach out or contact you?
Yeah, well, my personal website is ni.chol.as. Outside of that, maybe LinkedIn. I'm not big at posting on the socials right now, but LinkedIn might be the best bet.
Awesome. So we'll make sure we add that to the show notes. And thanks for joining. And this brings us to the end of another insightful episode of the Growth Ventures podcast. I hope you found our discussion today enlightening and inspiring. Remember, growth is a journey, not a destination. So keep exploring, keep learning, and keep pushing the boundaries of what's possible. I want to thank all of our listeners for joining us today. Your support and curiosity are what make this podcast possible. If you enjoyed today's episode, please consider leaving us a review on your favorite podcast platform. Your feedback helps us improve and reach more people. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on future episodes packed with valuable insights from industry leaders and innovators. This has been the Growth Ventures Podcast. I'm your host, Hamlet Azarian. Until next time, keep growing and staying innovative.